Jesus ever exist? The historical evidence no one shows you. There comes a moment in the life of any honest adult when a dangerous question appears and refuses to go away. What if the Jesus I was taught to worship never existed as a real historical person? I am not talking about whether God exists or whether every religion is a fairy tale. I am talking about something much more specific and, for that reason, much more disturbing. What if the central hero of the Christian story is not a man of flesh and blood from Galilee, but a theological construction assembled piece by piece over the centuries? In this video, I am not asking you to believe me. I am inviting you to do something almost no one does. To take Jesus down from the altar and place him on the table of historical investigation. We all know the story. A Jewish carpenter from a tiny village called Nazareth, performing mass miracles, drawing crowds, challenging religious and political powers, making the very cosmos tremble at his death, and changing the course of human history. If that were even close to true on a historical level, we should find this man everywhere. In official records, in Roman documents, in Jewish archives, in independent chronicles. Yet, when we leave the Bible and step into the real first-century world, what should be a sea of evidence looks more like a desert. In this documentary, we will walk on that uncomfortable border between what religion tells and what history can actually sustain. We will examine the silence of the historians, the contradictions inside the Gospels, the miracles no one outside the Bible seems to have seen, and the older myths that were fused into the figure of Christ. This is not about attacking your faith. It is about asking one honest question. If even the founder can be a carefully crafted myth, what does that mean for the power of those who use this story to shape minds and lives? If you have the courage to stay until the end, you may not find the Jesus you heard about in sermons, but you may find something even more important: your own spiritual freedom. The first reaction many people have when they hear the question, "What if Jesus never existed as a historical figure?" is to laugh, feel offended, or step back. The religious system has trained generations to feel guilt or fear before they even start to think. Questioning already comes stamped as sin, but if you stop and take a deep breath for a moment, you will see something simple. Asking questions does not destroy the truth. If something is true, it can withstand investigation. What cannot bear questions is not God. It is the narrative of those who claim to speak in his name. When I talk about questioning the so-called historical Jesus, I am not attacking your spiritual experiences or the comfort you may have found in prayer. What I am putting on the table is something else. Is there, in fact, a consistent historical basis behind this character that the Christian institution has placed at the center of everything? When you look at other names from antiquity, generals, emperors, philosophers, we have a varied set of sources. Texts by different authors, inscriptions, official documents, reports that intersect. With Jesus, almost everything we know comes from inside the bubble of faith itself, from texts written by believers decades later with clear theological interests. You are not crazy, heretical, or blasphemous for noticing this difference. Maybe that is exactly where true spiritual honesty begins. Instead of protecting an idea at any cost, you choose to look at it with courage, even knowing that this may shake very deep structures within you. And this is where the next, even more uncomfortable question is born. If this Jesus was as important as they say, why do historians of the time almost never talk about him? In the next chapter, we are going to enter the territory of silence, the century in which the supposed Messiah passes almost invisible through the records of those who were writing history. When we take Jesus out of preaching and try to place him in the real setting of the first century, something begins to disturb us. Silence. If the story religion tells were even minimally faithful to the facts, the years in which Jesus supposedly lived should be full of traces, A preacher who draws crowds, provokes conflicts with authorities, causes turmoil in Jerusalem, and dies in a spectacular way during a major feast should leave footprints everywhere. But when we open the sources of the time, we find almost the opposite. Roman and Jewish historians talk about governors, rebellions, false messiahs, religious leaders, public executions, dangerous movements, strange phenomena in the sky. They describe in detail the explosive atmosphere of Judea, the tensions with Rome, the constant fear of revolt. In the midst of all this, the name that religion says is the center of world history almost does not appear. That is what I call the century of silence. Decades in which those who were writing real history seem not to have seen the glorious Messiah that sermons place on stage. A Jesus who, in the Christian narrative, makes the cosmos tremble, but who, in the documentation of the time, sounds more like a distant whisper at best. Of course, silence is not absolute proof of non-existence. The issue here is not mathematics, it is coherence. Does it make sense for such a grand character to leave so few traces outside the literature of faith? Or are real history and religious history talking about different things? At this point, someone almost always tries to rescue the picture by saying, what about non-Christian historians? What about Josephus and Tacitus? Did they not prove that Jesus existed? In the next chapter, we are going to do what almost no one does. Open those texts, read what is actually written, and see if they really can support the weight that has been placed on them. When someone starts to notice the silence of the historians about Jesus, the same attempt to cover the problem almost always appears. What about non-Christian writers? What about Josephus and Tacitus? Did they not prove that Jesus existed? Now we put those names on the table without fear and look at what really lies behind that slogan. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian of the 1st century. He was born around the year 37 CE and wrote his major work, Jewish Antiquities, near the year 93 or 94 CE, decades after the period in which Jesus would have lived. In that work, there is a paragraph that speaks of Jesus as a wise man, author of wonderful deeds, executed under Pontius Pilate, called Christ, and raised on the 3rd day. At first glance, it seems almost perfect, and that is exactly the problem. The text sounds more like a Christian confession of faith than the comment of a Pharisaic Jew. The vocabulary is devotional, the theology is Christian, and the praise does not fit Josephus's style in other passages. That is why much of modern scholarship recognizes that this paragraph was at the very least improved by Christian copyists over the centuries. There is also the mention of James, brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Even here we are dealing with a short line in a later work that may have received some retouching. And even if it were completely authentic, it would only show that there was a group linked to a religious leader named Jesus with a messianic title. That is very far from the epic Jesus of the Gospels. Tacitus, in turn, is a Roman senator writing his annals at the beginning of the 2nd century, around 115 CE, more than 80 years after the death attributed to Jesus. When speaking about Emperor Nero and the fire of Rome, he says that Nero blamed a hated group called Christians and that their name comes from Christus, who had been executed under Pontius Pilate. But Tacitus writes long after the events and is probably repeating what Christians themselves already said about their founder. There are no new details, no independent confirmation of miracles, no biography, only the echo of a belief already spread. When we remove the apologetic shine from these texts, very little is left. The non-Christian chroniclers do not give us the Jesus of the pulpit. At most, they show that there were Christians later and rumors about a crucified Christ. If even outside the church the basis is that fragile, the only thing left is to face the main source of everything, the Gospels themselves. In the next chapter, we are going to look at them not as sacred books, but as what they really are, theology written in the form of history. When people talk about the historical Jesus, almost always, without noticing, they are talking about one thing only: the 4 canonical Gospels. That is where almost everything we imagine about his life comes from. The childhood in Nazareth, the disciples, the parables, the miracles, the trial, the cross, the empty tomb. But there is a detail that is almost never mentioned from the pulpit. The Gospels are not diaries of eyewitnesses. They are theology in the form of narrative. Most scholars today consider the Gospel according to Mark to be the first to be written around the year 70 CE, shortly after the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke come later, between about 80 and 90 CE. John is usually seen as the most recent, between about 90 and 100 CE, or even a bit later. The authentic letters of Paul are usually dated between 50 and 60 CE, almost always earlier than the Gospels. In other words, first comes a Christ preached in letters, in a mystical and theological tone. Only decades later do the biographical narratives appear. None of those 4 texts says anywhere, "I was there and I saw this happen." We now call them the Gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, and according to John, but those titles were added later. Originally, the texts were anonymous, and here we find a point that almost no one comments on. The names we use today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are Latin or Greco-European forms that reached us through translation. In 1st century Galilee, no one would call a fisherman John in the way our modern Bible does. The closest equivalents would be names like Matityahu or Yohanan in Hebrew and Aramaic. Mark and Luke are clearly Greco-Roman names, which already shows how the tradition that reaches us is filtered through a Hellenized world, very different from the peasant village we imagine. The same is true of the very name Jesus. The letter J simply did not exist as a distinct letter in that time. The character we know as J only began to be differentiated from I near the end of the Middle Ages and really stabilizes from the 16th and 17th centuries onward. In the 1st century, in Greek, the name appears as Jesus, and in Latin as Jesus, forms that derive from an earlier Semitic name. The most accepted view today is that the original name of Jesus in the Aramaic and Hebrew of that time was Yeshua, a shortened form of Yehoshua, Joshua. Some scholars also mention the shorter form Yeshu found in later Jewish texts, possibly as a popular or even pejorative way to refer to the same name. All of this reinforces the central point. These texts were not born in a neutral office with a historian taking notes. They were born in theological, Hellenized communities, translating names, adapting sounds, and trying to make sense of a Christ who was already an object of worship. Each gospel responds to concrete problems, to justify why the Messiah died, to explain political failure, to adapt the message both to Jews and to non-Jews, to reinforce specific doctrines. When you read them from a distance, you see that the main goal is not to record what really happened, but to persuade. The stage is historical, but the script is theological. And what if, instead of treating the Gospels as live footage of Jesus' life, we treat them as what they appear to be? Different interpretations by different communities, trying to give a narrative face to their Christ of faith. That is where things get even more interesting. Because when we place Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John side by side, we do not find a single coherent Jesus. We find 4 different versions of the same character. In the next chapter, we are going to enter that maze, 4 Gospels, 4 Jesuses, and see what that reveals about the nature of this myth. When we put the 4 canonical Gospels side by side, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that feeling of one single perfect story begins to crack. The church talks as if there were a single film about Jesus, with 4 cameras filming the same scene from different angles. But when you really read, it looks much more like 4 different scripts, sometimes helping each other, sometimes colliding. It starts with the birth. In Matthew chapters 1 and 2, Jesus is born under a star that guides wise men from the east. Herod orders the babies in Bethlehem to be killed. The family flees to Egypt and only returns after the king dies. In Luke chapters 1 and 2, none of that appears. There are no wise men, no massacre, no flight to Egypt. Instead, there is a Roman census forcing Joseph to go to Bethlehem, shepherds visiting the child and angels singing in the fields. They are two different narratives, built with different intentions. If you try to fuse both, you create a big Christmas story that none of the authors actually wrote alone. The genealogies tear open the seams even more. Matthew chapter 1 presents a list of ancestors that runs from Abraham to Joseph in a certain order. Luke chapter 3 gives another genealogy, going from Joseph back to Adam, with a different sequence of names. The father in one list is not the same in the other. The order changes. It looks less like a civil registry and more like two pieces of theology in the form of family tree, both trying to show that Jesus fulfills the prophecies in different ways. Even the way they portray the personality of Jesus changes. In Mark 13 verse 32, he admits that he does not know the day or the hour of the end. In the Gospel of John, especially, he looks much more like a divine consciousness walking in human form, knowing from the start who will betray him and controlling each detail of his hour. In Mark and Matthew, on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, his last words are calm, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." In John, it is different again. It is finished. After his death, the differences continue. In Mark, 3 women go to the tomb and find a young man dressed in white. In Matthew, there is an angel, an earthquake, and Roman guards terrified. In Luke, several women go, see 2 men in shining clothes. Then there are appearances on the road to Emmaus. In John, Mary Magdalene has a more intimate encounter with the risen one in the garden, and the storyline of the other disciples changes again. The general skeleton is similar, but the details, which are exactly what a historian would try to align, slip away. None of this is accidental. Each gospel is doing theology in story form. Each one shapes the character, chooses scenes, emphasizes certain lines, creates symbols to respond to the questions and crises of its own community. The result is not pure history. It is the narrative construction of a powerful religious myth. And that leads to an even more serious question. If even within the Bible, the versions of Jesus differ so much, what about the great miracles and cosmic events that, according to these texts, shook the world? In the next chapter, we are going to look directly at that. Darkness at noon, earthquakes, a star guiding wise men, dead people coming out of their tombs. And we will ask why, outside the Gospels, history seems never to have noticed any of this. When you dive into the Gospels, you get the impression that the whole world shook because of Jesus. The sky darkens at noon, the earth trembles, the veil of the temple tears, stars appear out of nowhere. Wise men travel guided by an impossible point of light. Kings order babies to be killed. The dead come out of their tombs and walk through the city. It is such a grand sequence of scenes that one question becomes inevitable. How is it that almost no one outside the Bible seems to have noticed any of this? Think about the crucifixion scene. According to the text, in the middle of the day, the sun goes dark for several hours. The earth shakes, tombs open. Many bodies of holy people who had died rise and appear in Jerusalem. That is not a discrete healing in a forgotten village. It is a package of cosmic and supernatural phenomena taking place in a religious capital inside an empire obsessed with signs and omens. Romans recorded eclipses, comets, earthquakes, and rumors of prodigies. Jews did the same. Yet when we open the writings of the time, we find silence. No historian describes a day when the sun darkened connected to the execution of a Jewish preacher. No one reports an invasion of resurrected dead walking through the city. No one writes about a massacre of babies in Bethlehem like the one Matthew describes. Neither curious Romans, nor shocked Jews, nor outraged enemies. It is as if all that spectacle had taken place only inside a liturgical narrative built to give supernatural weight to the death and birth of Jesus, and not on the stage of recorded history. The same applies to the beginning of the story. A star guiding wise men from the east to a specific house. A king ordering the slaughter of children in an entire region. Desperate families, collective mourning, a national trauma. And again, outside the religious text, nothing. No mention of a decree of Herod killing all boys of a certain age in that area. No note in chroniclers who love to write about the cruelty of rulers, scandals, and disasters. Someone might say, God is not obliged to leave evidence for historians. Of course not. But then we are no longer talking about history. We are talking about pure faith. The point here is another. Religion claims that these events were real, that they happened in this world, in concrete dates, places, and contexts. If that is the case, why does the surrounding world seem not to have noticed? When you look calmly, these huge miracles begin to look different. They look like narrative devices, scenes built to transmit a theological message. The darkening sun, the tearing veil, the dead who rise, all of that speaks in symbolic language of judgment, the end of a cycle, and the opening of a new access to the divine. They work very well as theology in the form of story. As verifiable facts, however, they collide with an almost total void. And then comes the inevitable question. Are we looking at reports of concrete events, or at myths staged in the format of historical narrative? If written history almost never registers these things, perhaps the next step is to ask about the ground itself, about the stones, the ruins, the cities. What does the archaeology of Palestine really confirm, and what does it contradict about the world of the Gospels? In the next chapter, we are going to step out of the page and onto the earth and see how the soil of the first century does or does not match the sacred text. When we leave the pages of the Gospels and put our feet on the ground of Palestine, something important happens. Poetry meets stone. Archaeology is the collision between what is written and what is buried. And there we start to see cracks that are almost never shown in sermons. First, it is true that archaeology confirms much of the background. The Roman Empire was real. Herod existed. There was a temple in Jerusalem. There were synagogues, peasants, poor villages, dusty roads. No one here is saying that the setting is pure fantasy. The stage is real. The question is the script that was laid over it. When we look at what archaeology finds, we see a general picture of life in the first century, but almost nothing of the specific grand events the Gospels describe. There is no clear evidence of a baby massacre connected to a decree of Herod. There is no archaeological trace of earthquakes that devastated Jerusalem on the day of the crucifixion. There are no material marks of a mass upheaval caused by the miracles of a preacher who supposedly drew crowds all over the region. Even symbolic places like Nazareth raise questions. Excavations show a tiny, insignificant village, more like a cluster of simple houses than an epic stage. The image of a vibrant center of great events clashes with what the soil reveals. A poor, peripheral place that would hardly have been the focus of the world. Archaeology does not deny everything. It says something more subtle. The context is real, but the narrative looks inflated. It is as if the Gospels had taken this concrete world and projected a theological story on top of it. And that leads to an essential question. If even the ground confirms the setting more than the hero, where did this powerful Christ who dominates the pages come from? In the next chapter, we are going to look at the figure that is actually the earliest written source of Christianity, the Christ of Paul, a revealed entity seen more in the skies of mystical experience than on the dusty roads of Galilee. When we look at the sources of Christianity in chronological order, a surprise appears. Before the Gospels, which, as we saw, are generally dated between about 70 and 100 CE, come the letters of Paul, written around 50 to 60 CE. That means the first Christ that appears on paper is not the biographical Jesus of the Galilee stories, but a figure revealed in visions. Paul's letters are the oldest Christian texts we have, and it is striking to see what does not appear in them. Paul almost never mentions the childhood of Jesus, does not talk about Nazareth, does not retell parables, does not describe specific healings, and does not repeat the speeches we read later in the Gospels, in part because those Gospels had not been written yet. He does not show the slightest concern in reconstructing the biography of a wandering teacher. His focus is something else, a Christ who died and rose in a spiritual dimension, and who reveals himself directly to him. Paul says he knew Christ by revelation, not by living with him. Paul's Christ speaks from above, appears in visions, and reveals mysteries hidden since the foundation of the world. This Christ looks more like a cosmic being than a simple teacher walking the roads. When Paul wants to claim authority, he does not say, "I walked with Jesus in Galilee." In practice, he says, "He appeared to me in glory and entrusted a message to me." This changes everything. It shows that Christianity did not start as a circle of people reminiscing about the human Jesus they knew. It began as faith in an exalted Christ, accessed through revelation, scripture, and symbol. The detailed biography, with scenes, dialogues, and locations, came later in the Gospels, and that raises the inevitable question. If the original Christ of the communities was this mystical entity, did early Christianity really need a biographical Jesus with childhood, adolescence, daily routine, and a specific address? In the next chapter, we are going to explore exactly that. A Christianity that worked very well with a heavenly Christ, and how only later someone began to fill that emptiness with the figure of a Jesus from Galilee. If we look calmly at the beginning of Christianity, one thing becomes very clear. The religion did not begin with a group of people telling nostalgic stories about a teacher from Galilee. It began with communities gathered around a heavenly Christ, accessed through visions, revelations, scriptures, and rituals, not through biographical memories. Those first communities did not need to know what Jesus' childhood was like, the sound of his voice, what he ate each day, or his exact street address in Nazareth. They needed something else, a divine figure who could guarantee forgiveness, salvation, meaning in suffering, and hope of life beyond death. For that, an exalted Christ enthroned in the heavens, tied to powerful symbols like the cross, blood, body, and spirit was enough. Look at the central elements: the shared meal, baptism, death and resurrection, the promise of return, the struggle between flesh and spirit. All of that works perfectly, even without a detailed biography. You do not need to know if Jesus healed one particular blind man in one specific village. You need to believe that the Christ you invoke has power over sickness, guilt, and death. That is theology, not journalism. Paul's letters and other early writings show a Christianity that already functions with that structure. Christ is a cosmic key, a revealed secret, a bridge between the human and the divine. Faith revolves around who he is in the spiritual realm, not around a step-by-step record of what he did in Palestine. Only later, as the religion spreads, questions arise that demand narrative. Where was he born? How did he live? What exactly did he teach? That is when the Gospels gain strength, filling a space that earlier was occupied mainly by myth and symbol. And this is the delicate part. When you start to compare that early Christ with older religious traditions, you see that a lot was already in circulation: saving gods, divine sons, deaths and resurrections, light conquering darkness. In the next chapter, we are going to step into that forbidden ground, the recycling of myths, from ancient solar deities to the Christ of the Church. When we look at the Christ of the Church with some distance, something uncomfortable appears. He does not arise in a vacuum. Long before anyone spoke the name Jesus, the ancient world was already full of saving gods, divine sons, figures who die and return to life, Deities connected to the sun, to light that conquers darkness, to the cycle of nature that dies in winter and returns in spring. In many cultures, the pattern repeats itself. A divine figure who descends, suffers, is sacrificed, and then returns to life in some way, and with that brings salvation, fertility, or victory over death. Solar gods who seem to die at the winter solstice, when the light is swallowed by the longest night, and who return as the days grow longer again. Festivals, symbols, dates, all of that existed long before the Church organized its calendar. When Christianity arrives, it does not create from zero the idea of a Son of God, light of the world, sacrificial lamb or savior who defeats death. It takes symbolic structures that were already available, especially in the Greco-Roman world and in Jewish imagination, and rebuilds that puzzle using Jesus as a new face for an ancient archetype. It is as if the system took a mask that had been used many times before, the God who dies and rises, the solar avatar, the mediator between heaven and earth, and pressed the face of Christ onto it. That does not weaken the psychological impact of the myth. On the contrary, it is precisely because it recycles deep, ancient symbols that it works so well. It speaks to very old layers of the human psyche. But then comes the question almost no one wants to face. If the Christ of the Church is largely assembled on top of older myths, what is left when you strip away those layers? In the next and final part, our closing reflection, we are going to face exactly that. If the hero is a myth, what remains? What is left of faith, spirituality, and the search for meaning when the central character steps down from the pedestal and is seen again as a construction? That is where historical investigation meets its most intimate consequence. Having come this far, you may feel two things at the same time. A certain relief, because old doubts finally took shape, and a deep discomfort, as if someone had touched the foundation of the house where you have lived your entire life. We have seen the silence of the historians, the weakness of the so-called external proofs, the Gospels functioning more as theology and story form than as reporting, Paul's Christ emerging as a revealed entity before any rabbi biography, and the recycling of ancient myths layered over the figure of Jesus. When you put it all together, an uncomfortable possibility appears. The central hero of Christianity may be, to a large extent, a carefully constructed myth. Then comes the question that really matters. If the hero is a myth, what is left? Many people stop here and panic, as if, without this character, nothing else had any value. But maybe the truth is the opposite. Maybe when the myth falls from the pedestal, it is the first time you have the chance to meet something more real than any ready-made story. Your own consciousness. Without an external savior to carry everything on his shoulders, you are invited to take responsibility for your life, for the choices you make, for the way you treat others, and for the world you help to build. Without the threat of dogma, spirituality no longer needs to be obedience driven by fear. It can become honest investigation, direct experience, ethics lived in daily life. None of this requires you to hate religion or declare yourself against God. It only requires that you refuse to live on your knees before stories that cannot bear to be examined. The question that remains is not, what should I believe now, but something much more serious. Who do I become from today on, knowing that I can choose the truth, even if it costs me the myth I was given? From here on, it is no longer about Jesus. It is about you.
I will reveal the forbidden wisdom.